My background. So I serve as the VP of ecosystems at Tabnine. What does that mean? It means when we started as a developer company back 7, 8 years ago, and when I joined 4 years ago, it meant I really took on all of sales, marketing, customer success, et cetera. If you're working with developers or you are a developer, you'll know that no developer ever wants to talk or hear the word sales engaged in their world. So hence don't use sales. That's the why. But also in fairness, work with a lot of other partners, capabilities. Tabnine exists in an ecosystem. How do you make it work best for all those involved? So that's background. I was at GitLab for 4 years before that. First couple employees at Google Cloud, and was there for about a decade, and IBM before that. So if that rings a bell or is helpful, awesome. If not, random facts, probably not as needed. So let me give a little background of what we're going to do. So today we're going to cover, and I'll give you a little background on what Tabnine is, but we want to actually cover this more broadly around the notion of what is generative AI? How does it apply to this use case? So we're going to use this as a use case. I'm going to do it from an illustrative standpoint of how does this apply to perhaps other use cases? Generative AI is everywhere. It's the biggest buzzword, and who knows where it's on the Gartner hype cycle. For some of you, it may still be on the upper hype cycle. Some of you may be on the back end of the curve. My twin brother would call that the slope of cope. So you may be in anywhere along that line. Nonetheless, we want to give you some context on how this fits, how you should think about it, maybe some frameworks that you can approach it. So that's the goal. We'll see if I'm any good at it, and I'll take your feedback. So I'm not seeing any open questions, but again, please jump in and add those as you go of things you're hoping for, or if something I put up there cues you. History and background. Tab9 is started and has...
Quick thing. We cannot see your slides. I don't know if you have them.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, let's try that again. How's that?
That
Now it's, by the way, it now has a green box around it. So that's amazing. Good. Solved the problem. A little context sort of Tab9, kind of where we came from. So we're the original company in AI for coding. When we started at this 6, 8 years ago, AI looked a lot different. Generative AI literally was not coined. So although that seems normal maybe to us, or at least maybe to me, because I hear it too often, it didn't even exist as a term. So when we started, it was just a autocomplete on steroids is kind of how we ended up usually when we started with developers. Through that process, though, we work with 1 million+ developers that use Tab9 every single week, and the vast majority of them on a daily basis. We have worked across companies from Atlassian to Khosla, and we work with companies as secure as the Department of Defense, and also to large bank, et cetera. And that's an area we operate, and hence I think some learnings and some parts of how generative AI plays out in a more highly secure and or regulated space is going to be a lot of kind of what we cover. So to that end, what kind of does Tabnine? So a little bit of framing to this. So if you're a developer, you're going to be used to the world living in what's called an IDE, or an individual development environment. Think of this if you're not in one. This is like Word on steroids. It's where you write all your code. It gets all tested. It's all about workflow and how you can most efficiently write, change, and evolve code. That is where most developers spend the vast majority of their time. And so when we look at, if we look at examples and other things, it's going to be set in that context. Where is the developer living? Where are their eyeballs? How do we meet and help them the most? Whole bunch of stuff that this is going to cover. So Tab9 operates in sort of like 2 primary big areas, and this applies, I think, to models, which we'll get to, in completion. So I'm in a stream of consciousness. I know where I want to go. I know what I want to code. I know what I want to get done, but it helps me just do it much faster. That's really what we think of as like inline completions. That requires a very different model. It has to be super fast model. And for context, it requires a huge number of tokens going back and forth, because every time you hit a new key, functionally, the entire string changes. So that's one view, and that's a model. That's kind of where these started because the models were smaller. And another set of models that we also use, and we'll get into these, is really what would be traditional chat models. And this is really where I think people are a lot more familiar in this get mainstream is, with a chat GPT, now with a Gemini, et cetera. Those are larger models, and those are very useful for answering longer questions, tend to give much longer suggestions back, et cetera. Both are functionally where the developers will live in both worlds. And as you apply these to other use cases, the same thing's going to apply. You need to think about the size of the model, the data into it, et cetera, and we'll give some frameworks for that. But high level, this is really kind of where Tabnine operates. And our focus originally wasn't when we started this, we were not specifically focused on highly secure environments necessarily, but we architected in the way Tabnine's operated, and I'll have some architecture a little bit later, some things if you want to think about it. But we architected originally as a startup and a small company. We operated around the notion of transparency and control have always been foundational of the way we build things. That was initially predominantly because it required trust, and developers, if you are on the call, you're a curmudgeon and you're grumpy, and that's okay. It also means you require that you want to know where things run and you want visibility as an engineer into where that works. So that's just how we function. But the good part is, as this has evolved, it set us up really well to meet those requirements for companies that have to sneak net or run something fully air gapped, all the way up on the other side to millions of developers that just use our SaaS all the time. So this on the left here that you're looking at, these are questions that Tabnine regularly might get answered, and it would give long suggestions, and we'll do some more examples as y'all want, and certainly ask me questions if there's things you want to see. I probably can show it if that's of interest. And then there's just core capabilities that really are all about speeding up exactly what a developer's doing. So why are we covering this, and why I think interesting. Some of you may be actually looking at adoption in a generative AI for code, but even if you're not, this is probably the first place that most organizations adopt, the first place that generative AI gets applied. And there's a couple reasons to it. It sits inside of a larger software development lifecycle, which we'll kind of highlight. It's got good checks and balances to it. Also, code is very, very good as a language because it's very structured, right? So the more structured you are, the better. Good question. Hey, by the way, Donald, we'll cover that. I'll jump right in that, which is good. So the data here is like, hey, is it real? So I think the question is like, is it happening? Is it real? And what are people seeing? This is just some good basic data to it. So generally in terms of what we're seeing, and again, we have millions of devs, so I have some pretty good information. 45% increase in time saved to write code. That's going to be a big deal to developers. 30% on more highly complex. So it gets to do things like unit testing. So if you're a developer, you don't write your unit tests. You can admit it here. It's a safe place to say, I don't my unit tests. I should do more. No one likes writing them, but they're actually important and super useful from that standpoint. Developers a whole lot happier because they don't have to do a lot of the grunt work that tends to eat into it. And then the last one is like just from adoption, 78% of companies are going to have this adopted in the next 3 years. So it's kind of the first place people go to adopt. So kind of want to touch and hit in there. I'm going to adjust Donald. Quick thing here. The evolution as we go through this is autocomplete on steroids would have where generative AI first started. And that was, think of that because the size of the model were smaller. It meant that the size of the outputs would have, in context windows were smaller. So when we started doing this, just for context back, this is like pre-GPT-2, right? So we're talking like 5 years ago. And we'll get into kind of those models. So the initial models were smaller models. And so we had optimized when Tabnine started, actually we got it optimized on the CPU and runs on your laptop, right? So in that case, that would have been focused a whole lot on quicker completions. And now from a chat interface, you can do quick completions or I would say this is kind of like autocomplete on steroids. And then you have a chat interface that can give you much larger and much more contextual feedback. And you need to mix and use both of those. And we'll do break these into some structure so you get there. And I don't know that's a spectrum of AI. I'm always, I would use the term, we'll be specific to LLMs. So I'll say AI is a little too broad, so I'm going to be like very specific on this. Today, we're talking large language models and how they work. So we're going to dig into this. And Donald, you hold me to account. I think I'm actually going to answer your question, but even give it a little more depth. So let me dig into this, and I think we're going to break this into components. So what I want to do is maybe take like almost step back and say, Tabnine as an example, great, and I can use it because it's contextually useful to like make it real. But if we take a step back and say, like, what are the key components of anything that's using a generative AI solution? Um, I always think it's easy to think of these as three components, right? One is your user interface workflow. This is getting, for lack of a better, think of getting the right suggestion, the right user, right time, right place, right? So that's user interface. The second one that we're talking about is the actual model behind it. And there's obviously, this is the place that I think a lot of the discussion lands. And the third area to ask questions around is data specifically and data sovereignty and security. This tends to be where the security, so data and security. So I think these are the three large stool, like legs of the stool that we're going to go through. And I'm going to break these into some details. Let me see. I think we're going to start. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the first one here on user interface and design. Um, this is probably the most difficult to do well for at scale. So the general use case that we think of on this that kind of made this that people really picked up generative AI was ChatGPT, and it was like ask a question and I get it back in just a basic text back and back forward solution. That is still the way a number of a lot of, say, companies and stuff would operate. And I think this is a place for you to dig in anytime you're evaluating or trying to understand how a solution works. Um, this is really important because this is, again, back to the wherever it is, getting the right suggestion to the right user, right time, right place is in some ways the more difficult piece to it. And I'll articulate this sort of in Tab9 parlance, but I think you can ask this elsewhere. Um, in the case of Tab9, building on Donald's question, there's kind of developer comes into their IDE and when they're writing code in kind of really two separate mindsets. One is a mindset that says, I know exactly where I want to go and I know what I want to do. I just want something to help me write it faster, right? This would have been sort of mode one that Tab9 started in. And this is going to be, I'm writing the code and it's going to finish out a line, add another line, but you're talking chunks of code that are, 1 to 3 lines, very, very contextual to exactly what you're writing. So it's Tab9 in this case is taking great context from above and below whatever code you're writing, giving you, really inline, very good context to it. But it's designed and needs to be in, we're talking responses in 200-300 milliseconds, right? And that's really important because you're headed in a direction as a developer, and this needs to not slow you down. And so that's an interesting, a very different engineering solution that you have to solve to than like the chat solution, which we'll get to as sort of mode two. But in this mode one, this requires a lot of work. For the Tab9 use case, it'll apply in other generative AI, maybe not as much, but you have to get the right suggestion, the right user, right time, right place, or otherwise it's noise. And they just turn it off. And they're like, I'm out, you're bothering me. Thanks for the suggestion that's like, 2 seconds old, that's now broken up my code and didn't, right, they're out. They're like, I'm done with this. And developers in this case, it's super hard to make happy. As I said, I'm a former bad developer. I'm a slight curmudgeon. The better the developer, the more grumpy they tend to be. Just as how y'all work. We love you a lot and you give great feedback. But this is the part that you look for in a solution. Sometimes, by the way, to understand how well some company's doing that is difficult because you don't know how it's resolved. In the case of our space, it's really easy. You go into developer feedback in all the marketplaces, whether that's over in VS Code or it's in JetBrains or it's with Eclipse, and you can look at the feedbacks because developers give you feedback. Again, you guys are great. And then you can understand whether someone has a good UI UX, at least in our space, easy to understand that, right? You go read it, you're like, they get it, they supply this. This is all of the nuance into there is kind of what we're talking user interface. So that's kind of, and of those, there's group one, I want to go code quickly. Group two is sort of a chat capability. This has a very different aspect to it, and we'll get into some of these here, but the chat function, or when you're going to thinking about writing more complex code, that usually you're coming to it from the standpoint of I don't really know what I want to do. What already exists in my code base? How did someone in my organization already do this? Those are questions that fit much better under chat interface. And that's a different model. So in that case, you're going with a much larger model and you're going to be giving a whole lot more context in. So kind of walking through this, we're interested, you're going to see again the fun poll and quiz. I think I get to answer this. So I'm going to say, they just came up for you is what organization, what do you see as the biggest challenge to adoption? I'll be fascinated. I will not taint the answers, but if you want to also share that, I'd be fascinated. If you don't mind, also, we'll get it later, but since I won't see this, if any of those you have a strong opinion, if you drop it into the Q&A, I'd be kind of fascinated where this lands as we go. So to that, sorry, we'll get here just a sec. So that's on the UI UX at the high level. That's a piece to think about. So when you go in and adopt a solution in generative AI, how is the company or the group, or even you, if you're writing it, how are you getting the right user, the right suggestion, right user, right time, right place? Think of those as the 4 R's, kind of this is in that group 1 and user interface. The second one, and we're going to jump over here, is the model. And this is where everyone loves to talk about it. It's like, is it Anthropic's Great Claude, and what's next with OpenAI and Gemini, and all good. These are very interesting, and there's a couple ways going about that. Obviously, you can make a big bet on one solution. I'm going to be opinionated here, which is not a surprise. There's a couple different ways to do models. I'll share my opinion at the end. Let me do context of how you can think about models first. What you see in front of you is the evolutionary tree, how these models evolve. So back in like 2018, 2019, you'll see on the right-hand, way down on the right, this is GPT-1, GPT-2. In terms of where they evolve, there's also, by the way, if it's dark, it's closed, it's open source. If it's an open circle, it's closed source. Just for context. The evolution of these models have gotten continued to get larger, and there's a lot of other tooling and ways around it. But the big couple of questions to think about is, are you taking an open model or a closed source model? Not surprisingly, from a trend standpoint, the big open source models at this point really are being driven mostly by Meta with the Llama-based models. That's not a huge surprise because the closed models are all tied generally to a platform. So Google has Gemini, Microsoft really functionally has OpenAI, which ironically is called OpenAI, but not open source. Separate conversation. Those are ones to think about if you're adopting or you want to use these. I'm biased, so somewhat biased. I used to serve on the board of Linux Foundation. I think open source wins in almost every case, and I think it allows transparency and stuff that's super helpful. But these are some sense to understand sort of how it's evolving. So those are kind of 2 things to think about: the models that are powering it, open or closed. The second is sort of the notion of single versus multimodal. I'll just briefly say in the single versus multimodal, single models thinking on, say, hey, only specialized, say, to do code. And a multimodal model might, like a big Gemini model, you could throw pictures at it, or you could find text, you could put, a bunch of different things against that, and it's ready to sort of answer those questions. That implies also then when you get into the model, the size of model, right? And the data training. So the size of model is kind of related to that. If it's a single modal model, it's going to be smaller. Multimodal is more flexible and bigger. The size of the model is largely important to you from the standpoints of the cost of running it. Obviously, the larger the model, the more expensive that is to both train and run. And also the larger the model, the more data is required to train it. So this is kind of that point 4. And this applies if you're trying to fine tune a model, you're going to need a lot of data. But I'm going to talk about the large models you might use. That requires that they go get a bunch more data. And there's a couple ways to go about this, but it's something that we'll get into that leads us sort of in the next slide. Before I go into the data in the model, so let's just fundamentally thinking more data, the bigger the model, the more data you need for the points. That's a very simple understanding, and then we'll get into a little bit of how they go about doing it. One point before I leave here in terms of view on models. Our view at Tabnine is that we have no idea where the models are going to go. We have no idea who's going to win this, and so we offer choice. So at least in the Tabnine view, you can use our model, which is smaller but fully permissive, and we'll get to why we care about that, all the way up to you can use Claude or you can use Llama, you can use, OpenAI. Those are all models that we enable. Each one of those has implications in terms of security. So the data used to train them in the security leads us sort of to the last sort of thinking, and I would say this is around the data space. And again, this does apply across all models and all use cases, so you can take it as you want. First one is questions in terms of the data that goes into it. Again, remember, the larger the model, the more data you need. And it's very important to understand where this data comes from. The basics on large from security is, I'm going to start with the security piece, and then I'll get how that data applies to security. Like, where does it run? Do you have control over it? Do you know what's gone into it? Can you put in your VPC? These are questions most of you are going to require. And to do that, you have to have a smaller model. So just to be clear, you can't take GPT-4 and put it in your data center. The only way to solve that is go to Microsoft and buy a API license key or OpenAI. Those models are too large, unless maybe someone in the government, if you're large enough, maybe, but very unlikely that you're going to be able to have and run your own large model there. So just understand that's kind of just a concept. If you have to have it in place for control, you either have to have just enormous unlimited resources, or you're going to have a smaller model. That's just a kind of basic trade-off. From the compliance standpoint on this, back to the data that goes into the model. In order to train a very large model, think the step from GPT-3 to GPT-4 was probably 2 orders of magnitude larger amount of data they needed. The challenge on that is a lot of data didn't exist, or they had to go looking other places. So from a standpoint of how you would go about doing that in our space, the way that Microsoft, in this case, Microsoft GitHub Copilot, they didn't have enough data just in GitHub itself was enough for sort of the first to train a large model for them on like a GPT-3 style. To get to what they are now at GPT-4 in the very large model, they had a brilliant engineering way, which is they gave away GitHub Copilot for free, which is great, but they got all the data from the users as a result. That allowed them to collect a huge amount of very valuable data, and that's what ended up in the model. If you ask this across the board, most of the large, in fact, I believe almost all of the large model providers cannot provide nor know exactly what they've been trained on. Challenge that has a big challenge. So from a security standpoint, the implication is, while we think this is magic, AI is nothing more than machine learning, and machine learning operates under the same basic premise. Good data in, good data out, bad data in, bad data out, copyrighted data in, copyrighted data out. So that's a piece that you need to ask, and that applies, again, it applies clearly to code, but it applies to anything that you're using. The only way to ensure that you have compliant code coming out of a model is that that model has never looked at copyrighted and or proprietary code. Tabnine, the way we solve that is we literally we only train on fully permissive open source, and we give our customers, if they would like, under a fully protected model and under NDA, we will literally give you every piece of code that it's trained on. I will be blunt, that is an enormous amount of data, but we are fully transparent on that. Again, for some use cases, this may not matter, but this is a question that I think many people overlook when adopting generative AI solutions, is not asking the question or understanding what the model was trained on, because the only way to ensure that you don't have that come out, or in a legal sense that you can prove that whatever data or code, in this case code that came out, is not copyrighted code, is to be able to sit in court and say it's never seen it. Like, here's all the data it's seen that is all my proprietary code, so my custom model, which we'll get to how that works, and all this fully permissive code. Like, this is the corpus of data it's all seen. That's how that's the only way to operate from that standpoint. Now, last piece we're going to spend a little bit of time on around data and customization, and we'll get kind of this third bucket was customized. We've talked about how you secure the data, where the data comes from, which allows you to know what the data comes out. And then the question becomes, okay, we've talked about models. Is it purely about the model? Like, is it just whatever model I choose, bigger, smaller, otherwise, answers those, proves the answer on those questions? Short answer is no, because there's a bunch of interesting ways you can go about customizing these. If you're interested in this, like again, you'll have our information. I'm happy to like walk you through this. But foundation, there's a couple basic ways that you can go about customizing this. So all of it would require, though, to be clear, good customization, as we talked about before, requires good data in to get good data out. So for most of you, this is going to land on, put a little bit of weight on you, which is we can customize a model very, very well for you, but it is based off of the data that you give us. So in the case of Tabnine, I don't know whether your data is good or bad. Um, you have to tell me that. So if you give me a bunch of interesting code, I could I can fine tune a model. We can use RAG. We can use vector databases. We can use graph databases. There's multiple ways that we might go about that. And I'm not going to get, if we have time, I'm happy to detail that if someone wants to. But there's ways to customize and bring that value, bring your custom or your data in line with the models to make the model functionally your model, which is great. But it does require that the data you give is good. So good data stewardship has been something we've always pushed. It's been going on forever. It's been talked of forever. We have know this as a requirement. It's no different now, right? If you give me old crufty Java, that may be awesome. It's going to give you good old crufty Java back out as recommendations. You may love that, or you may be trying to modernize and moving to a different version, in which case you just give me crufty Java, you're going to get crufty Java suggestions back. I'm not helping you the way we need to. So this requires just some human and validation that what you're putting in to fine tune, train that model is really good code. For our case, this applies, of course, to anything else that you would do on a custom model. It just happens to be for the code use case, a bit more obvious. So hopefully that helps a little, just for a quick review, like basic stuff to think about. Again, those kind of three pillars, and then we'll get a little bit of how this applies to the developer use case. But hey, questions again. UI, UX, really spend your time figuring that out if you're working with someone or building. So if you're building it, a lot of attention there. It's actually the hardest part to solve. If you're looking for a solution, go and try and figure out what the end user feedback is. Again, easy for us because all of this data is public and you can go look in the marketplaces under reviews. Who's got a good UI, UX? Easily answered. But this is a key aspect to getting the most out of these. Know your models, really think through and examine those models and determine what is good for your use case. Size a model, open source or not, are you going to build it, run it? How do you want to customize it? All good questions that you'd ask. And then, as always, the data and the security. So hopefully we covered those three. I would always think of those as the three areas if you're evaluating a solution to consider and to evaluate. So to that end, happy to give a little bit of context here. So Tabnine, what you're seeing here is going to just run through some basic, this is determined an example of what Donald was asking. This is auto-completion on steroids. So if anyone's not so much familiar with this, this is just an example of an IDE. Adds a comment while you're writing your code, kind of fills pieces out, and then it's going to start filling out code in line as you're writing what you're writing, right? So this is designed for that first use case we talked about, which was developer knows where they want to go, and they want to make sure this is super hyper fast at delivering what you want. You'll see this is not sped up in any way, shape, or form. This is how fast it works. And so you're seeing from this aspect, the way that it's answering question allows you to literally work in speed of mind, right? We're talking 200-300 kind of millisecond quick response time. A couple other places. So that's kind of give a sense of that's was our history. It's also really important for a solution, at least in our space, is to do this well. Just for note on the side note, hardest engineering is doing this one, not the chat one. The chat one's much easier to solve because you don't have time constraints, don't have nearly as many tokens, not nearly as expensive. This is the hard one, as it turns out to solve. It's also the one that almost no one else does well in our space. Let me talk a little bit for those of you, now I'm going to shift a little, so if you all are not in the development space, I'm going to assume you are, but feel free to ask and I'm happy to adjust a little bit. This should give you a little bit of context of where all of this is going. So think generative AI applied to code development. How is it going to be used, or how is it being used? This is both many of this already in place. And it really hits all the way from your planning. So think I'm in Jira, I'm writing a ticket, and I'm saying, here's what I want to do. Tabnine has a Jira plugin that literally pulls those in and will help you actually, you pull your task out of Jira and it says, here's where we would start, lines it up to all the code base you already have and say, hey, by the way, did you know we solved this problem, this API call? We've written this API in elsewhere in the code base looks like this. Here's a suggestion for how you might solve that problem. So again, can go all the way upstream to kind of planning, but all the way downstream here into explaining legacy code. I'm new to the thing. What's going on in this code base? No one's seen it. I need to document it. Kind of all the way up and down. And I was going to put this in a circle, as it turns out, can't comment as well. So in theory, really, software development is really just a continuous circle or infinity loop or whatever way you want to write it. So this is continual, more continual in terms of how it applies. But you'll see this applies everywhere through the software development lifecycle. In Tabnine, we're already engaged in most of these places and doubling down on really enabling things like refactoring, complex code bases for users as well. Let me see. I'm going to do pause for just a moment. The direction kind of from here. So now we kind of framing. We've talked a bit around how to think about generative AI solutions, what pieces they need to have. I'm going to give a little bit of like, hey, where it's used. So the next couple are just quick. I'm going to go through they're more or less quick demos of use cases. So I'm going to break what you've just seen into use cases, but I'm going to pause for 2 seconds. Any questions on, I would say, more on the education of how generative AI functions, how I should think about that anyone wants me to go into more depth here. From here, I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes going a bit more into the specific use case of software development. But anything anyone wants to hit, ask a question now would be good. If I don't get something, if I see something quick shortly, I'll jump back, but I'm going to say time to press on. So I'm just going to walk you through some quick contextual here. This is kind of use case of onboarding. New developer, I come in, how does the project, what in my projects, what in my code base? I'm new. I don't need to generally know how to do JavaScript. I need to know exactly how we do JavaScript in the Department of Health. I need to know exactly how in the FBI we are writing API calls, right? Point being, that's what this is designed for. Again, it's customized and personalized to your use case, your code base, and everything else. So really helpful new developer from an onboarding standpoint. This gets to the planning idea, right? Hey, I want to write in this case, say it's a weather application. This is going to go into and say, hey, I need to do this API call. Good example, like, hey, I need to do a Maps API call or a weather API. Do I call it weather.com? Do I have another API that we use? The developer is not going to have visibility as much as we'd like to pretend they'd read through the code base. They don't know how we're doing it. So how do you repeat that and do it more consistently? And this gives both how it would be done and discoverability where it fits in the code base. So that really helps someone from a planning standpoint. Creation is probably the most obvious use case. I need to write code and I don't know how to do it. Hey, I need to build this class. Great. Quick copy paste kind of brings this right in. Noting just for highlighting, these are all chat use cases back to that initial quick code completion, know where I'm going. This is, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I need to do this exploring. So you'll see the speed's a little bit different on response, but also a different mindset for a developer. This is the fun one I highlighted from Jira issue. So you can implement Jira at Jira. It's literally going to pull in that issue, all the context to it, and it's going to say, here's how you code or solve to that Jira ask, right? To some degree, it also does require then your Jira issue have some level of context. If people don't fill out your Jira well, guess what? Doesn't have good data, won't work as well. But if you do a pretty good job of defining that, a very interesting solution kind of can pick that up. Testing, I hit on this. This is, I think developers actually one of their favorite use cases because they like to write unit tests. What's really awesome is when you say, I've just finished this. Can you please write this unit test for me? Yeah, to be honest, yeah, much appreciated. And then as you choose those, if you like it and it comes in, you can up or down thumb it for your team. So it can be like, that unit test was great. So this also helps the model continue to be more personalized, kind of what you're doing. Fixing code, not working, super helpful. Any have short commands. So in this, there's even while you're doing code, it'll do quick suggestions. What's the change look like? Kind of all the above. Again, also this meets developers wherever they are. So, for us, the only other solution we really see is GitHub Copilot, which is a Great solution if you're only in VS Code and you're in the Microsoft only world. Most of our customers have to operate with higher security inside their own VPC and in different IDs and different, Eclipse and otherwise. That's a pretty good example. This is interesting. We just rolled this out as code review, but this is rules. So in this case, these are specific rules that you can pull up. Like, here's exactly how we do database hierarchy. This is how we would do transactions, etc. So you can ensure that, and then it picks it up, and Tabnine will say, that's nice that you wrote it this way, but the way this is done at the Department of Energy is this. Here's how we would do it. And then it helps in the merge request, help your whole code base and everyone write more consistent specific codes. So if you have good rules, it's a full rules engine that's based in there to help you develop. Documentation, pretty straightforward. Maintenance, all across the board, change it to a different method. This helps with kind of migration and stuff. So last thing, obligatory little like, hey, why do people choose Tabnine? Super simple. Private. So we never have trained on anyone's code. Your model, your code is your code, your model. All of it, it's always yours, will always be yours, and we'll never use it to train or anywhere else. It's personalized. Personalization is super important. This is what takes, so let me say it's super simple. The best model in the market today will always lose to a personalized model if you have good data and you personalize it. And that personalized model can be much smaller, far more efficient, and much better at what it's doing. So what we see high level to understand in terms of where the market's going, I think we're going to see these large models continue to be good for general purpose, but for most organizations, they're going to move to multiple models. They might have one for their, Python team. We have a huge Python team at a bank that does old Python. There's 4,000 developers. That's their trading app. That's going to be a model. And then you're going to have, hey, I've got a COBOL, old code I got to migrate. That's a model. So over time, these personalized, smaller, specific models are going to always overperform. Will always overperform those large models. The good news is they're also less expensive to run, and you can run them wherever you want. But it does require some level of looking through and engagement with your code base, et cetera. So it does have a little bit more work on the front end, but the return is significantly better. And the last one we talked about, protected. Like, hey, this needs to be run where I have to have obviously indemnification, but most important, license compliance is going to become more and more important. US less so. We're already seeing in Europe, just to be clear, there's already regulation in Europe. In the US, we hear GDPR and we're like, oh yeah, we're GDPR. Well, that was driven by Europe, and now we kind of live under that rule because it made sense. There's a bunch of rules in Europe that are coming down there saying you can't have a model, you cannot use a model that has copyrighted code. The only model in the market today that does not have copyrighted code in it is Tabnine. So some of these are areas just to be like future-proof. And our view in Tabnine is we want to give you optionality. So you should be able to choose if you want to use Claude, because it is, and by the way, is a great model for this. If you're comfortable with what's coming out of the model and that, you should be able to use it. But if you need a fully secure option, you need a Tabnine protected model, you can use anywhere in between. So we continue to offer Llama, and we launch OpenAI, and we've got Cohere, all of which are awesome models, and we have a protected model. So Tabnine's landed on we're not smart enough to figure out where these are going to be. So we're going to take the best in the market, and we know there's a need and a demand, particularly oftentimes in highly regulated areas, for a fully protected model. So we will continue to invest in enabling that for every user, will always be there, and giving access to the biggest and best out there. And you can do that real time. So we have developers that use Claude for one thing and Cohere for another, and they have a very open development environment. And we have others that have literally had taken Tabnine, we've sneaker netted it into a fully air-gapped solution, and it's writing code for things that have to be air-gapped, as you would imagine. So that I think is we already talked about most of this. Encryption, obvious there. Deployment. I should have gone here with the deployment flexibility. Can run anywhere on any platform, anywhere that you have. It does require NVIDIA chips somewhere. So if you want to run it on-prem, you will need some NVIDIA chips, and we can, answer a few questions there if you need to. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave with the last part for you to kind of think about. And this is sort of the last piece. We talked about everything going to a personalization. And there's kind of four levels you can think about personalization. And thankfully, our new head of marketing has done this better than I would have, which made them all C's. Four C's is much easier than, and by the way, check this out. I'm going to brag on for a second. It's the three P's and the four C's. It's like this guy's done marketing at some point in life. He's great. Clearly, I'm terrible at it because I would not have done this. But as you personalize models, so think about this again, useful for this use case, but broadly applicable. The context, awareness of what's going on in the developer for their ID. So me as a developer and Christina as a developer are working on different things. It should have that context of what I'm working on versus her, and it'll have different suggestions. So that's context. Connection, we've talked about, connects it into your entire code base so that you have awareness of what else is going. We talked about coaching. Coaching is saying, I have a specific way I want this done. So not only is the code base, but I have specific practices I want to enforce. And then customization is sort of on the far side. If you have enough data and it's interesting enough, you may decide that from a customization, you would fine tune a model. That's probably the furthest right in terms of effort. These kind of go from bottom left to upper right in terms of both data needed and effort. Each one, you'll get context right out the bat, connections, straightforward, connect to your code. Coaching, you're going to have built these, and a lot of people do, some don't. And customizations, super valuable, but say you have a big COBOL code base, great place for that kind of thing, or a unique code base that isn't broadly seen, super useful. So I think I've successfully landed through most of it, and keep me honest on this one. I think we've kind of come to the end and want to open up to any additional Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, but I have other slides if people need them, and we can jump in from there. Donald, I'm going to ask you to respond if you're still here for us. I think I covered more than what you asked and covered what you asked, but let me know if I got your question. I think I got it, but I can revisit it if that is not at the level you needed. So Donald's saying, to wrap up, development and definition of AI is really more like a moving target. Oh, yeah, 100%. Also, by the way, definition of AI is whatever someone with marketing wants to sell you, just to be totally blunt. I would think of this, so today's conversation was very much around particularly machine learning and large language models. How that's, generally speaking, someone said generative AI, not AI, but generative AI, what they're really talking about is a large language model is what they're talking about as the foundational technology to that, right? But it's evolving. So now we're layering multiple large language models together. I talked about it. You might put a graph database. You might put, query altering. They're going to start wrapping these. But the one that really got this fired up, the core technology that got us to AI now becoming kind of so front and center in the last 2 years, is the notion of large language models. But to understand this, I would encourage you to not think AI, but think machine learning, and go through the machine learning, the ways that machine learning functions. That's the best way to understand kind of where you're sitting in the spectrum. They're kind of taking AI and layering over all of machine learning. Go to the base and look at what machine learning does. But your short answer is yes. The short answer is yes. And advanced automation, no, it's not just old advanced automation. It has made a big step forward. But in some ways, actually, what we're seeing is good large language models layered with automation. So in Tabnine, we used to do a bunch of automation too. We are combining kind of two capabilities together for the output you're seeing. So yeah, Don, I think that was pretty clear. Awesome. Any last questions that people might have? Would be happy to jump into them. And then you'll get a follow-up. We're here to help anytime we want. I want to lastly, while I'm waiting to see if any questions come in, thank Carahsoft. Been super helpful for us as Tabnine to have a partner that can help us navigate through all of the government requirements, needs, et cetera. We came to them for the obvious reason. They have those relationships, know where it lives. And Tabnine's the only solution that meets a lot of what we're seeing in the government and the secure space, that you have the control and specialization, personalization necessary. So seems to be so far been really fun, and we appreciate. Thank you, Carahsoft, for having us. Hopefully this was helpful and gave you both context of what Tabnine perhaps does, but perhaps also a framework for you to think about this going forward with what will inevitably be a conversation we get to all have around generative AI for the near future. Maybe we'll rebrand it, but at least for now, I'm sure we'll get that a bunch.
Thank you, Brandon. And please feel free if you have any questions, shoot them into the chat or the Q&A box as we wrap things up. Um, and I just wanted to close this webinar off by saying thank you guys for coming. Um, this was delivering on the promise of Gen AI for coding with maximum security and transparency. If you guys have any additional questions post-webinar, please feel free to reach out to tabnine@carahsoft.com. Otherwise, you will get a follow-up with the information and slides as well. And we thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Brandon, again, and we appreciate the content.
Thank you all so much. Appreciated.